All right. We are in the fifth chapter of the book of Ephesians and beginning with about verse 16. This whole book so far has been dealing with the issue of the Judaizing teachers that are trying to bind the law and circumcision on the Gentile Christians. And he starts out chapter 5 talking about the Christian liberty that we have in Christ, that we are no longer in bondage to sin, we're no longer in bondage to the law. That has been fulfilled and taken out of the way. And then he talks about uh, not to use their liberty as an excuse to sin. That's not the kind of liberty he's talking about. Of course, we've seen Paul deal with this issue before over in Romans, the 12th chapter. That issue comes up. Are we going to continue in sin that grace may abound? And he comes back with no, God forbid. And so he says, don't use your liberty in that way, nor do you use your liberty in a way that is offensive to your brethren. One of the other issues that he talked about in the book of Romans was the issue of eating meats. And there were those who had a conscience against it because of their associating it with idol worship or with the restrictions of the law of Moses. And so there in the book of Romans, he says you don't use your liberty, even though you don't have a conscience against it, you can eat it and there's no problem. But if you're eating it offends your brother, love your brother. That's the issue, and he's saying very much the same thing here. Verse 14, he says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And we talked about uh, you could divide the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, into two sections. The first four having to do with man's relationship with God. We're to love God, put Him first, no other God, no idols. We don't take His name in vain and remember to worship Him. Those first four. But then the last six has to do with man as he relates to his fellow man. And that's where you have it's wrong to murder, steal, covet, and so on. And if we love God like we should, we'll observe the first four, won't we? That's what Jesus said. The first command was to love God with all your entire being. And then the second was like unto it, you love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you're going to fulfill the law. And that's what he's saying. This fulfills the moral issues that are brought forth as far as the law is concerned. He gives them a warning. He says, but if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another. In other words, uh, you're not to have this kind of spirit that is selfish, greedy, and out to just get what you want, no matter what it does to anyone else. Uh, it's a good way to get yourself destroyed, isn't it? Because somebody's going to come along that's stronger than you are. Uh, I was I was told that growing up. No matter how strong you think you are, there's somebody stronger than you are, and you'll meet him one of these days. You're acting up, you're going to get what you deserve, and so that's what Paul is basically saying here. Then in verse 16 he says, "I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." This idea of walking, when you're talking about walking, what is he describing? What is he saying? It's your manner of life, isn't it? It's the way you conduct yourself. Paul has a great deal to say about walking. In the book of Ephesians, especially, you have him making reference to walking. For instance, in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called. Here he's talking about walking worthy in an appropriate manner, one that identifies yourself as a Christian, one that is consistent with living a Christian life. He goes on from there with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And so if you walk worthy of the Christian life as Christ wants you to, then you're also going to be an instrument of bringing about unity. You're going to live in peace. If all of us are trying to follow Christ, we're going to be in agreement, aren't we? And so that's what he's saying. And then he goes on in the 5th chapter with several more kinds of walks. For instance, in chapter 2, he says, and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling savor. So what we're doing is we're looking at the walk here in Galatians, and we're getting a commentary on what he's meaning by what he's writing in Ephesians. That just fleshes it out, doesn't it? It kind of gives us exactly what he has in mind. Then down in verse 8, he says, you who were once darkness, but now are light in the Lord, walk as children of light. So again, talking about your way of life needs to be a reflection of Christ. In that way, we become the light to the world, don't we? It's not our light, but we're reflecting, like the moon reflects the sunlight. We are to reflect the light of Jesus to the world. And that's what he's talking about there. And then finally in verse 15, he says, see that you walk circumspectly, as not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. And so there are all sorts of walks, and that's not conclusive. If you go to the book of Thessalonians, there are several references there as far as walking as we should. And so that's exactly what he's talking about. Colossians 1:10. He says that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. So there again, the idea of walking and walking worthy of the Lord. So our walk, our conduct needs to reflect Christ. And that's what he's talking about here. And if you do that, then he says you're going to be led by the Spirit. You're not going to fulfill the lust of the flesh, but you're going to be walking after the Spirit. And then he goes into this discussion about the war that's taking place within each one of us. He says, for the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. Does that bring to mind anything else that we've studied by the pen of Paul? Makes me think of Romans, the 7th chapter. He goes there in a lengthy discussion about the idea of being led by the flesh and the Spirit, and this war that's taking place. And it's a struggle, and oftentimes we give in to the flesh and do the things that we know we shouldn't do and that we don't want to do. But because of our weakness in the flesh, we sin sometimes. But we need to be led by the Spirit. And if we're led by the Spirit, our intent, our walk is going to be in the light with Christ. And in that case, First John 1:7 says, if we walk in the light as he's in the light, what happens? There's a continual cleansing. That blood that Jesus shed on the cross is there for the Christian that is going to take care of the sin. In other words, we're no longer in bondage to that. We have a solution. We have a remedy. Not that then we turn around and say, okay, I can just keep doing it. I'm going to do what I want to, just gratify whatever desire I have. That's not walking in the light.
Mankind ever since the Garden of Eden.
Yes, that's exactly right. Isn't that what led Eve to give in? Was the lust of the flesh. She saw that it looked like it was good to eat. She wanted that knowledge that Satan was saying that she would achieve. It would raise her on to be on a level with God. Her knowledge would be increased. And so, yeah, that's the appeal. And it is very much a part of us as human beings to have this. And this is a constant war that's taking place. And we need to be aware of that. Satan is always there, and he's there to attack when we're at our weakest. There are periods in our lives where we are very weak. Uh, it can be in the middle of a depression. It can be at a point where maybe we're grieving. It could be where we're just simply worn slap dab out and weary. but he's always there, and he's going to try to get you when you're at your weakest point. And that's when we need to be in prayer and depending on the Lord, because he promises he'll give us that strength, but we've got to be seeking for it. That's being led by the Spirit. We are trying to do our best to live as God wants us to, but we do need to be aware that this battle is going on, and he's going to make a point. I think Paul does in maybe 1 Corinthians 10 or maybe 2 Corinthians 10. You better beware. If you think you're standing, you may be about ready for a fall. Just when you get puffed up and think, man, I'm doing great and I've got everything going, that's when Satan's going to get us. One, we're being proud, and pride's the chief sin of the devil, isn't it? That's what we're told. And so we have to be very, very careful there. He says, but in verse 18, but if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Here again, this is making that point about the law. Uh, these Gentiles are about to become or put themselves under the law, and it puts them in a bondage. You remember he's already said, if you are going to try to be justified by the law, you are bound to keep it all. You become a slave then to the law, and you have no solution. There's no remedy for your sin under the law. And so there he's trying to make this point. You don't want to be under the law. You're not under the law if you're led by the Spirit. That he's going to go through and he's going to identify how we can know whether we're being led by the Spirit or whether we're being led by Satan. The works of the flesh as opposed to the works of the Spirit. And so he's going to give a very lengthy listing here of those things that are considered works of the flesh. Beginning there in verse 19, he says they're evident. It's like, anyone with common sense is going to know these are things that are of worldly carnal nature, and they're wrong. And he starts the list out by saying that adultery, fornication, uncleanness, anything that's filthy, unclean, uh, inappropriate. He's grouping these all together. Lewdness, that which tends toward lust, letting your mind dwell on things that tend in that direction. Uh, we are inundated in our culture and in our civilization with things that lead this way. If you watch TV very much at all, uh, there are advertisements that back when I was growing up, it would have been considered X-rated. Victoria's Secret, for instance, and it goes on. They advertise everything that you can imagine, and sex is the selling item. The car dealer's out there, and here's this woman out in a swimsuit, and she's helping to sell the car. And so we as Christians have to be very, very careful. It's almost like we need to be like the horses and mules that used to have blinders so that they didn't see except right down the road. And as Christians, we need to put on spiritual blinders, because if we don't, then we're not superhuman. We're going to be in this battle, and we're going to lose that battle if we're not very careful. We can't be the person that tries to straddle the fence and get as close to it without sinning. And that's what a lot of people try to do.
We can't be like a friend of mine told me. He went to he said his preacher asked him, when is it a sin to look upon a woman and lust after her? And the preacher said, where it becomes a sin is when you look off and you look back. He said, well, I'll never sin because I ain't going to look off.
Oh, no. I think he was right in the middle of that sin, wasn't he? But here's the emphasis that he's making. The one led by the Spirit is a life that rises above the carnal, and that what we might speak as just coming natural. The natural human being is the one who's wanting to give in to these lusts. to be gratified, all these different things, and so he's starting out with this kind of listing. Then it goes on with verse 20 to idolatry. What's another word for idolatry that we might relate to more closely than the idea of say, bowing to an idol? Do you have any text in the scriptures that talks about what idolatry is or related to? Covetousness, yeah. Because what do you do when you covet? You make possessions, getting something your main priority, and you're giving yourself to that, aren't you? And in that way, it becomes a god to you, small g.
He talked about coveting neighbor's possession.
Right. And we're not to covet anything that our neighbor has, whether it's a slave, servant property, or even his wife. You have, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, there. Then it goes with sorcery. Uh, do we have a problem with sorcery during our lifetime today? Think about it. We do, don't we? In what way? Well, in our culture, according to what was on the music awards and this sort of thing, and at some of the national ball games, we have people that are worshiping Satan, aren't they? Giving in to him. We have practicing witches and wizards in our culture too today.
You can so Europe that it was just a huge satanic ritual.
Yeah. I didn't see that, but I read about it. Yeah, you're right. Uh, it's being promoted openly, isn't it? Uh, it's extolling Satan and his followers, and with that comes witchcraft, wizardry, and this sort of thing. Uh, I think more than people who read their horoscope and look to it as a guide for what they're going to do during the day. What are they doing? They aren't giving God the control of their life. They're saying that other things control their life, the stars and so on. That's a form of wizardry. Now, during this period of time, there were people who were practicing witchcraft. Do you have some biblical example?
Simon.
Didn't Paul run into one on the island of Cyprus?
Simon was one of them. Simon was one of them.
Right. And then Philip with Simon the sorcerer, Peter confronting him. So yeah, it was something that was a part of their culture then. According to the Old Testament, what was the children of God's attitude supposed to be toward anyone that was practicing that? They were under a death sentence. God said they are to be put to death. Anyone that was practicing that. That's when Saul went to the witch that he did, trying to bring up Samuel. And that was one of the things that some of the witches and wizards did. They claimed the ability to speak with the dead and bring them forth and get messages for that. And that too is a part of our culture. There was a movie made with Demi Moore, and it was about this ghost, but it had the idea of a woman who was able to speak to the dead, and it surprised her when in the movie it actually occurred. The ghost came and did speak.
Samuel come up too. You read the Bible account, she was surprised too.
Yeah, and she knew that when she realized it was Saul, that she could have been put to death because that was a part of the law as far as the children of Israel was concerned. But anyway, that's listed here as one of the works of the flesh, and it's put into this whole category of horrible sins, and then it goes into the very similar related attitudes as far as hatred, uh, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, and heresies. Those all reflect the same kind of idea, and it's someone who loves to argue, that is belligerent. He's or she's looking for a fight. It's again based generally on a selfishness, thinking I'm right, I'm always right, and I'm going to get my way. I don't care who I have to walk over. Uh, in business, on my way to the top, I'll step on anybody I have to, just grind them down. I'm going to get my way. And so that's the kind of description that he's making here. Heresies has to do with false teachings. It's people that's promoting uh, these Judaizing teachers would certainly fall in this category. A heresy is something that's avoiding or is opposite to the truth. It's putting forth those things that are wrong and false. And then he goes into envy, murders. Of course, all of this hatred and envy, jealousy is going to lead then to the ultimate sin, if you want to think of it in that way, and that is you commit murder. You get to the point that you despise someone to the extent that you want to eradicate them. Then he goes into drunkenness, someone who nowadays it would not just be alcohol, but it could be drugs, anything that will alter their consciousness, uh,
Impair the thinking.
impair, right. A lot of times it's done in a way to forget their troubles. And while they're intoxicated, they don't have to worry about those things that are bothering them. The bad thing is that when they come true and sober up, things haven't changed. In fact, they're worse because now he's not only got the problem or she's got the problem that caused her to want to drink, but then they have become addicted to what they were trying to use to solve their problem. And that's created a whole new problem.
There's one thing, and there's that I don't think we as human beings pay really close attention to, and that's taking care of pain. If you ain't careful, you get in deep trouble with pain medicine.
That's true. There are people who have become addicted from pain medicine that they had to take during an injury or surgery or this sort of thing, and so it is something that we have to watch and be careful of. Yeah. And I understand that. I understand that. Um, he goes on here with the drunkenness, the revelries. What does revelries refer to?
Right.
It's what? Rioting. Uh, it could go toward rioting, but reveling basically starts out as a joyful rejoicing and celebration. There's a scene that comes to my mind when I think about reveling, and that's what Moses finds when he comes down off the mountain. Because it started out as a rejoicing. They made this idol and said, "This is the God that brought us out of Egypt," and they're all celebrating. But then it degenerates into an orgy. It's a sexual orgy in the end result, because in their reveling and their dancing around, it becomes sensual, and it leads then to this kind of sin. And so this is what he's talking about here, and that's certainly something that takes place in our culture. It takes place in our culture. We have people that start out and they call it partying. It starts out, and usually then it's accompanied by alcohol. And when you have alcohol, uh, what it does, it allows you to override your inhibitions.
Lose control of yourself.
You lose control, and then you're doing things and acting in a way that you wouldn't otherwise act. Yes, sir, Joey.
Yes, sir. When it refers to drunkenness, and I look at this list, and in drunken state of mind, you're more apt to commit any of these sins and you are
Right.
so.
Right.
That's exactly right.
It literally takes away your conscience to the point that you act spontaneously, without thought, and then the next day, you know, you look and you will have some regrets of things you've done that will stay with you for the rest of your life.
Right.
And it's, you know, I'm not saying that you have to get drunk to do these things, but I'm just, you know, as I look at this list, that one thing that you can do on a consistent basis will lead you into any or all.
That's exactly right.
Here people,
It makes it a very dangerous activity. Uh, yeah.
Position. Basically, you're not going to be able to refrain from this.
Right.
yeah,
And you know, my granddad was an alcoholic, my mom's dad. I think I've told you that before. And he would do things and say things under the influence of the alcohol that he would never do if he were sober. And the next day, when you would confront him with it, he couldn't believe it. Oh, I didn't do that. I didn't say that. Well, yeah,
you
you did.
can't believe I said that, or
Right,
it's over with, and they had time.
right. And so they've wiped out a big part of their life, but they don't even remember what they've done. Yeah, yeah. And sometimes you find yourself where you never intended to be. You wake up and how did I get here? Yes, sir.
Usually, if you see someone who is we associate the word with them that they act foolishly because most of the time it's kind of in a it's embarrassing to us when if we were to be in our right mind, things like y'all are describing. You know, I would never. But when you are intoxicated around other intoxicated people, it's all foolishness.
Yeah,
You know, there's no how do you there's no check to where somebody says, well, that person's acting foolishly. Then nobody knows who's acting
right,
foolishly, right? So you're just surrounding yourself.
right,
If you work and put yourself in that position instead of looking now in foolish.
right,
And sometimes I know that people that's their surroundings that makes them not realize what they're doing themselves because everybody else is doing.
right, right. Yeah, it's an right. It's certainly something that a Christian has got to steer away from. Uh, God wants us to be sober minded. He wants us to be in control of our actions, our thoughts, what we're saying. And so this is diametrically opposed to what God wants us to be. And so not only here, but in many other places, we have the idea of drunkenness being condemned. And then he goes on with this little phrase, King James says, and the such like, the New King James just says, and the like. That's a pretty inclusive statement, isn't it? You know, for the person who says, well, there's nothing in the Bible that says anything about not using drugs. Well, no, drugs were not used other than alcohol being a drug. But this certainly would include that, wouldn't it? Because the end result of drug use is the same thing as the end result of alcohol use to a large extent, as far as altering the person's state of mind and what they're thinking and this sort of thing.
I'm not sure who I'm reading. I'm reading along with you. Um, this guy says right here on this section that sorcery is the attendant of idolatry, and he goes on and mentions the drugs of occult power and things grotesque or curious made mysterious had to do with they were creating these things like these drugs and they were giving that power to the quote nature god because they were taking these herbs and these you know before what we have today drugs were natural, right? Every drug today is based on some kind of natural discovery at some time in history, right?
Right.
We've compounded that exponentially, of course,
Right.
but it's still based on some kind of chemical compound. But he says here, from the use of drugs in incantations and exorcisms, the word pharmakia, here denoting sorcery, took its meaning. So that was the original source of where that word comes from that we now know in our modern society. Well, that was because this was part of the occult, to alter yourself
Right.
to a nature god
Right.
by taking natural,
Right.
and this was a form of idolatry.
Right.
And now, this is the most consumes the most pharmaceutical products of any people on the planet.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because we're still altering our minds to the nature god,
Right.
which aren't natural anymore.
Right.
They're not nature. They're companies and being ruled by darkness.
Right.
So we're still practicing
Right.
this in our country.
Right. Right. You can see Paul having these teachings in the culture in which he's giving this address, and like you referred to, these people had a God for everything. They had a God for love. They had a God for uh, joy, rejoicing, uh, of harvest, and this sort of thing. And so they would, in their worship to these gods, give in and have these orgies. They start out feasting and then go into the drinking and then dancing. And it was not long until they were having a mass orgy right there in the temple of their god that they were worshiping. And so you can see why he would list all these things and put them together. Right. Right. Yeah.
All that stuff plunged them into idolatry.
Right. Exactly. Included in the and such would be some activities that a lot of people want to participate in today, and that's dancing. A lot of people don't want us to talk about that anymore, but it comes into this category. Uh, Couples do on the dance floor those things that are sensuous and tend toward the sexual. And a normal human being in those circumstances are going to be led toward lustful thinking and lustful feelings. And so you're putting yourself in a position to not be led by the spirit, but be led by the flesh. And like I said, we don't hear much told about that anymore. Uh, I think going along with that same thing is mixed bathing. We have people generally that are going about when they're doing this activity in very, very skimpy clothing. And again, we're setting ourselves up, and I believe those things come under this and such like that we need to, as Christians, be very, very careful about. And it to me, it is shocking and a sign of the times, I guess, that we have young Christian young people participating in things like proms and wearing the most stylish outfits. And nowadays, the most stylish outfits for a female is to have a split all the way up to about here, showing a leg all the way down, and nothing hardly across the back, and sometimes great big holes in the sides. And we have Christian young girls claiming to be Christians and going to things like that, and dancing, and having young men place their hands all over them, and thinking it's all right. In fact, we have Christians commenting, and I've seen this on Facebook. Oh, how beautiful that girl looks, and there she is in this skimpy outfit, and yet, oh, she's so beautiful. Well, uh, I guess maybe in their estimation that may be, but to me, she's wearing what women of loose morals would have been wearing a few years ago. and calling it fashion and okay. And as Christians, we can't do that. We cannot allow our standards to be set by whatever our culture may say is okay. And I'm very afraid that we have many, many Christians that are allowing that to happen with their families and their lives.
Why is it when we see someone wearing something inappropriate, we turn the phone to somebody and say, "Can you believe she has this on?" Why do we have to show that to somebody?
Yeah,
Why don't we, when people post that stuff on Facebook, why are we still looking at it? Why are we showing it to other people?
that's right.
I mean, I've had somebody try to refuse to look at it.
Yeah,
If you're going to show that to somebody, show it to my wife. Don't show it to me.
right,
Put it in the "I'm ashamed of this" pile.
right. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, right. That's a good point that you're making there. All right, he says, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's pretty serious, isn't it? We want to be very blasé about many of these things and think, oh, well, it's not that serious, not that important. But Paul says it's extremely serious because it has to do with your soul salvation.
If we are in the world, something to take those things away from you, we bring madness and go into the kingdom because they got
Right.
it is.
Yeah, exactly. Now, on the other hand, he's going to show a different picture. He's going to look in a different direction. That's looking at one direction, those that are led by the flesh, that are under Satan's control, that are giving in this battle. They're making no attempt to shun that and to come away from it. He says, but then the fruit of the Spirit is love. You know, we can't overemphasize the importance of love. And when we're talking about love, he's indicating the agape love that's described in 1 Corinthians 13.
If you love me, keep my commandments.
Right. That's what he's saying. If we love Jesus, then we're going to do what he said. But if we have this love here, we're not going to be participating in any of these sins that we've just listed, because all of these sins are something that we perpetrate and do, and it affects someone else. You think about it. You know, you're talking about greed, selfishness, dissension, hatred, jealousy, uh, even drunkenness. You know, you can have people who said, "Well, it's a private thing, and I'm not hurting anybody else." Is that true? No. There have been many, many lives beside the person that's using the alcohol that has been destroyed.
Just takes a car wreck or
It can be that, or you think about a family that's destroyed because of it. Children who have gone through that. I remember my mom talking, and of course, because of the way her dad was alcoholic, she could not stand to be around anyone, even if they had just had one drink. If they had any smell of alcohol on them at all, she would not be around them. And we had nothing in our home at all, ever, which I'm thankful for. Uh, but she told about growing up with her dad being an alcoholic and what it meant to her. She could never have a friend come and spend the night because every evening her father was going to be drunk, and he was either going to be shouting and angry and running everybody down, or he was going to be happy and, you know, just acting foolish. He missed most of everything that she participated in. Anything that happened at night, he was not going to be there. So, yeah, it destroys people and their families. Here we have love being the first thing that's mentioned as far as the fruit of the Spirit, because if you have this love, it's going to cause you not to want to be a participant in any of these things because you're going to be concerned about others. Love reaches out. It's not focusing in. It's not looking and saying, what can I get? But it's what can I do for others? How can I make their lives better? How can I show them this love? And so I think that's one of the reasons that he lists that first. And then joy. For Paul to use the term joy, does that really ring a bell with you? Of anyone who could have whined and cried and said, "Why me, Lord? Look at what I've had to suffer in this other thing." It would be the Apostle Paul, but yet he's a man of joy. This is the second thing he lists: the joy of being a Christian and in Christ, with the realization of what God had done for him.
He counted it all joy what he had.
Yeah, he counted all joy, no matter what he had to give up or what he suffered. He was joyful because he was able to do that and as a means of showing his gratitude to God and to Christ for what he did.
If we as Christians today was stoned as he was, what would we do the next day?
Well, if we were in prison like he was, in stocks, would we be singing and praying and rejoicing?
Would we have showed up at services if we were stoned yesterday for
Yeah,
something we were doing?
right.
What would
We need to stop and think, don't we, Jimmy? Yes, we do.
I think Paul's joy is because obviously what God had done for him had allowed him to be a Christian, but his joy is based on what he knows is yet to come.
Yeah,
Right.
And the word in the Greek that's used for joy has no connection to earthly ties, no connection to the earthly things that most of these descriptive words that he's used over here, people would describe as joy or joyous
Right.
that have earthly,
Right.
sinful connection. This
Right.
joy is not connected to
Right.
That's what I mean. I've always thought the joy that he had is just be content, be joyous, regardless of what you're going through, because it's short lived.
Right.
The joy is yet to come.
His rejoicing came from knowing that God loved him and that Christ died for him and that he had a reward that was better than anything this earth had to offer. So that was a source of his joy.
We perceive as bad, hard, or negative in his life, that was okay because that is not going to last. He knew that, he understood that.
Yeah.
But the joy that was awaiting him
Right.
is the reason that I think that
That's exactly right. And then the next term is peace. Uh, he's in a battle with the Judaizing teachers right now, isn't he? Now, it's not an earthly fisticuff battle, but he's in a battle of ideas and teachings, isn't he? That is not descriptive of peace in our ideas. The peace that he's talking about is something that also is spiritual, and we'll stop there because I don't want to cut this short, but we'll pick up right here in the middle of this verse next Lord's Day, Lord willing.